The wagon didn't pick up speed until the Davis ranch was well out of sight, lost in the shimmering heat of the horizon. Hank kept the reins loose, allowing the horses to walk at a steady, unremarkable pace. He knew that in a place like this, rushing drew eyes, and eyes led to questions he wasn't ready to answer yet. Sarah lay on the blankets in the back, curled on her side with one hand resting protectively over her belly, as if she were trying to hold her world together with her own fingers. As they rolled past a dry wash and a stretch of neglected fence where the posts leaned in every direction, Hank felt a growing sense of unease. It was Davis land, fencing that no one bothered to fix because everyone already knew who owned it. If this moment pulled you in, hit subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. The story is about to get even deeper. I'm waiting for your thoughts in the comments. Hank hated how close and claustrophobic the territory felt despite the vast open sky. To break the heavy silence, he reached behind the seat and pulled out a bit of bread and dried beef. He unwrapped the food slowly, careful not to let the crinkle of the paper startle her. When he handed it back, she ate with a desperate, quiet intensity, like someone who had been conditioned to take up as little space as possible for a very long time. By the time they reached Hank's place, the sun had begun to dip, finally taking the sharp, punishing edge off the afternoon heat. His ranch wasn't a grand estate. It was just a low-slung house and a barn that leaned slightly but still held its ground against the wind. The corral was a patchwork of repairs, showing years of struggle, but it offered something the Davis ranch didn't: quiet. Hank helped Sarah down from the wagon, not by lifting her, which would have been an intrusion, but by steadying her elbow until she found her footing on the solid ground. Inside the house, he pulled out a chair and poured her a tin cup of water. She drank it down and then just sat there, her breathing slow and ragged. "You're safe here for the night," Hank told her, trying to offer some semblance of peace. Sarah looked at him, her eyes hollow as she repeated, "For the night," as if she had long ago stopped believing in any promise that lasted longer than 12 hours. Hank nodded firmly. "Night's all I'm offering," he said, and that limited, honest promise seemed to settle her more than a grand vow would have. But even as he spoke, something felt off to him. The air in the room felt thin, like the atmosphere of a place someone had just fled in a hurry. As Hank stood at the basin, washing the dust of the road from his hands, Sarah began to speak again, her voice low and distant. "He said it would be cleaner this way," she murmured, echoing her husband's twisted logic. "He said if people saw me like that, they'd understand." Hank stopped, drying his hands with deliberate slowness before turning to look at her. "Understand what?" he asked. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes dry and weary. "That I was a problem," she replied. It was the exhaustion of a woman who had been argued into a corner for years. "Did he tie you himself?" Hank asked, though he already feared the answer. Sarah hesitated, then gave a small, haunting nod. "He didn't rush," she added quietly. "That's what scared me." Hearing those words made Hank feel as if that brand-new rope was tightening around his own chest. Suddenly, a sharp rattle echoed from outside, a tin can hitting the fence. Hank froze instantly, his instincts screaming. The sound came again, a faint scrape like a boot brushing against metal by mistake. He moved to the window, keeping his pace steady and unhurried to avoid showing fear, but there was nothing visible in the yard or on the road beyond. He stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the dirt near the gate. There he saw marks that hadn't been there when he left that morning. Fresh boot prints, heavy at the heel. He didn't chase after them into the darkening shadows. Instead, he went back inside and latched the door tight. Sarah whispered from the shadows of the room, "Someone's out there." Hank didn't lie to her. "Maybe," he said, "maybe not," but he knew there was no comfort in the words. He reached for his shotgun and placed it by the door, not for drama, but simply because it was where it belonged. In his experience, gun moments were about timing, not noise. They ate their dinner in a heavy, thick silence that felt more like a shield than a burden. After Sarah finished the little she could manage, Hank laid out another blanket on the floor near the bed for her and claimed the wooden chair by the wall for himself. He sat there in the dark, a silent sentry against a world that had turned cruel. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, a sound broke the stillness, a careful, measured footstep. Then came the unmistakable, dry scrape of rope against wood. Hank stood up slowly, his joints protesting, and looked out into the moonlight. There, looped twice over the corral post like someone testing the weight of a body, was a length of rope. There was no one in sight, just a message left behind in the dark. Hank walked out, lifted the rope, and felt his jaw set hard as he recognized the fibers. It was the same brand-new, store-bought line. Whoever had done this wanted him to know they had followed him home. They wanted him to feel the noose. He cut it down and laid it flat on the dirt, refusing to let it hang there like a threat. When he stepped back inside, he found Sarah watching him, her eyes reflecting the dim lantern light. "They know where you live now," she whispered, her voice trembling with a guilt she shouldn't have had to carry. Hank nodded. "And they know you saw," she added. Hank looked at her and simply said, "Yes." The weight of the situation pressed down on both of them as the first light of morning began to bleed through the window. "What happens when the sun comes up?" she asked. Hank looked toward the road that led to the town of Cheyenne. He knew that Thomas Davis was already out there, writing a story of lies in the shadows, and Hank wondered what kind of paper a man like that would use once daylight arrived. In the morning, Hank said, his voice like iron, "We stop hiding." When the sun finally cleared the hills, it was hot and clear, as if the sky had no idea of the misery unfolding beneath it. Hank was already at the table, his coffee untouched and his eyes fixed on the road. Sarah sat across from him, her hands wrapped tightly around a tin cup as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. She watched the door with the kind of terror that only comes to people who expect it to be kicked in at any moment. "We're going to Cheyenne," Hank told her. Sarah stiffened, the fear returning to her face. "To the doctor," Hank added gently, "and to put our feet where people can see them." He knew that staying hidden only gave the lies room to grow. They needed the light of the town to expose the truth. They rolled out as the dust began to puff behind the wagon in soft bursts. Neither of them looked back toward the Davis land, but they both felt it behind them, a heavy, dark weight on their shoulders. When they reached the edge of Cheyenne, the town was just waking up. Hank pulled the wagon up near the livery and helped Sarah down with a steady hand. People began to notice them. Eyes followed them from the boardwalks, not staring yet, but watching with that slow, curious suspicion common in small places. "I'm going to send a message," Hank said. Sarah looked at him, confused. "To who?" she asked. "Someone who still answers when I ask," Hank replied, thinking of the few good men he still knew. Inside the telegraph office, the air was thick with the smell of ink and the heat of metal. The clerk didn't even look up as Hank slid a few coins across the counter. Hank chose his words carefully, like he was placing fence posts to hold back a flood. He sent a short wire to Sheriff Miller, listing only names and a location. Just as the key clicked out the final word, Hank heard the sound of heavy boots on the boardwalk outside. They were unhurried, confident steps. A shadow crossed the window and stopped. When Hank turned back toward the door, he realized he had run out of time. "Morning, Miller," a voice called out, easy and casual. Standing just outside was Deputy Reed, one hand resting near his belt and the other holding a folded piece of paper. Behind him, Thomas Davis stepped out of the shade, looking as if he had been waiting there for hours. Hank realized then that Davis hadn't been guessing. He had been watching every move they made. Davis wore a clean shirt and a calm face. The face of a man who fully expected the world to listen to his version of the truth. "Thought I'd find you here," Davis said, his voice dripping with a false politeness. "You always did like to do things the proper way." Sarah shrank back against the wall, her face pale, as the reality of the paper Thomas had brought with him began to settle over the room. Deputy Reed unfolded the document with a slow, agonizing deliberation, making sure the growing crowd on the sidewalk could see the official seal pressed into the paper. "I've got a formal complaint here," Reed announced, his voice carrying over the morning quiet. "Abduction and interfering with a lawful husband." He glanced towards Sarah, who was trembling beside the telegraph desk, and added, "This order says she goes back to her home immediately." Thomas Davis let out a long, theatrical sigh, looking like a man who was just as inconvenienced by the drama as everyone else. "We can do this the easy way, Hank," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a tone that was soft enough to sound kind to a stranger, but felt like a threat to those who knew better. "Or we can make it hard." Hank didn't rush to answer. Instead, he took the paper and read it carefully. He had seen enough legal documents to know that this one was clean enough to fool a crowd of onlookers. It was signed by Justice Hartwell, a man known for smiling in the front pew on Sundays and counting his favors on Mondays. Reed shifted his weight, his hand never straying far from his side. "Let's not make a scene," he urged as people began to gather, their whispers filling the air. A woman nearby muttered that a wife belonged with her husband, and a man spat into the dirt, saying Hank should have minded his own business. The narrative was already shifting, and the town was beginning to believe the lie. Sarah grabbed Hank's sleeve, her voice a terrified whisper. "Please," she begged, "not for them. Not like this." Hank raised a hand, silently asking for just a moment of space. He stepped forward half a pace, physically placing himself as a barrier between Sarah and her husband. "You didn't even ask her what she wanted," Hank said, his voice steady. Thomas just smiled. "I don't have to ask," he replied. Reed lifted his chin, tapping the document. "The paper says she's his property, Hank." Sensing the moment was tipping against them, Hank moved without any hint of hurry. He drew his revolver, not to point at the men, but to lift it high into the morning air where everyone could see it. A sharp, deafening crack split the morning air as he fired a single shot straight up. Nearby horses jumped and whinnied in alarm, and someone in the crowd let out a startled swear. The echo bounced off the wooden storefronts and then died away, leaving behind a silence so thick you could almost chew it. Hank lowered the gun and rested it back in his holster, his expression unchanged. "Everybody move back," he commanded. "Nobody is getting dragged anywhere just yet." Sheriff Miller hadn't arrived, but the town knew Hank wasn't a man who played games with a weapon. Thomas's confident smile slipped for the first time. "You just made this whole thing worse for yourself," Thomas hissed. Hank looked him in the eye and replied, "Or maybe I just stopped it from getting stupid." Then Sarah's voice came, small, fragile, but remarkably steady. "I want to speak," she said. Reed hesitated, but before he could shut her down, an old man from the crowd stepped forward, clutching his hat. "That paper doesn't say he gets to tie her up to a tree like an animal," the man said. Another man joined him, and suddenly the crowd's energy shifted again, becoming unsure and suspicious. Thomas's eyes hardened into something cold and dangerous. Hank leaned in close to Reed, speaking low so only the deputy could hear. "This isn't over, and you know it." Reed swallowed hard, looking at the restless crowd. "The doctor's office is just down the street," Reed muttered. "She goes there first. After that, she goes back." Hank nodded once, a grim agreement. "After that," he said. They walked to the doctor's office with the crowd parting just enough to let them through, but the weight of 100 pairs of eyes pressed in on them from every side. Inside the office, the heavy door clicked shut, finally cutting off the noise of the street, but the silence that followed felt just as suffocating. When they emerged an hour later, Deputy Reed was waiting, his arms crossed, with Thomas Davis standing right beside him like a shadow that refused to fade. Reed cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at Sarah. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "courthouse. We settle this properly." As they turned to leave, Thomas leaned in close to Hank, his voice a low, confident rumble. "You can't win on paper, Hank," he whispered, a smirk playing on his lips. "And out here, paper is all that matters." Hank met his eyes with a cold stare. "We'll see," was all he said. As they walked back toward the wagon, a young boy from the livery stable brushed past Hank in a hurry, his shoulder knocking into Hank's arm. He didn't stop to apologize, but Hank felt the distinct slip of folded paper being pressed into his palm. Hank didn't look down. He kept his face completely plain until they were clear of the main street. Once Sarah was settled in the wagon, he unfolded the scrap of paper. Inside was a scrawled note, just a name and one word written in crooked, hurried letters: rope. Hank refolded it and tucked it into his shirt pocket, his jaw tightening. If Thomas thought paper was the only weapon in this fight, He was about to learn a hard lesson about what happened when paper met proof. Hank drove them toward the quieter side of town, away from the prying eyes. Sarah watched the street through the slats of the wagon, her shoulders hunched tight as if she expected every boot step on the boardwalk to be coming for her. "You did good back there," Hank said, keeping his eyes on the road. Sarah let out a breath that sounded like it physically hurt her. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. "You stood on your own 2 feet," Hank corrected her gently. "Most folks don't even manage that when the whole town is watching." A tiny flicker of something, not quite hope, but close enough, crossed her eyes. Hank pulled the wagon up behind the livery stable, where the honest smells of hay, sweat, and old leather made the world feel sensible again. He stepped down slowly and walked into the barn as if he had all the time in the world. "Morning," Hank said to the shadows. A boy named Jimmy, no older than 12, was sweeping the floor and didn't look up. "You shouldn't be talking to me," Jimmy muttered. Hank nodded. "That's smart," he agreed. He dropped a coin into the boy's palm, treating it casually, like payment for a sweeping job. Jimmy finally glanced up, his eyes wide with fear. "I didn't mean to get you shot," the boy whispered. "You wrote rope?" Hank said, his voice low and gentle. Jimmy swallowed hard. "Mr. Davis bought new rope," he confessed, the words rushing out. "Not ranch rope. Town rope. He bought a whole coil." The boy paused, looking around to make sure they were alone. "And he didn't want it on his account," Jimmy added. "He paid cash." Hank felt his gut tighten. "Where?" he asked. "General store," Jimmy said. "Mrs. Stone keeps the ledger like it's scripture." Hank looked toward the street, wondering why a frightened boy would take such a risk. "Why tell me, son?" Hank asked. Jimmy hesitated, then looked at Sarah waiting in the wagon. "My sister had a baby once," he said, his voice cracking. "Folks said things. Men said things. I don't like men saying things." Hank didn't praise him with flowery words. He just nodded, offering the respect one man gives another. "One more thing," Hank said. "Boots. Mr. Davis has a notch in his heel, like a bite taken out." Jimmy tapped his own heel to demonstrate. "He drags it a little when he's mad." Hank thanked him and walked away without rushing, though a fire was now burning in his chest. He drove straight to the general store, hitched the team, and helped Sarah down. She stayed close to the wagon, her head lowered while Hank walked inside. Mrs. Margaret Stone stood behind the counter with a pencil tucked into her severe gray hair and a look that could freeze boiling water. "Hank," she said sharply, "if you're here to buy nails, buy nails. If you're here to borrow trouble, take it outside." Hank leaned an elbow on the counter, meeting her gaze. "I'm here for rope," he said plainly. A woman was tied up near the Davis land. "With new rope." "Your kind of rope." Mrs. Stone didn't flinch, but her pencil stopped moving over the paper. "I don't mix in family matters," she stated firmly. Hank nodded. "Neither do I, usually, but someone used your rope to do something a decent town shouldn't want on its conscience." That word, conscience, landed hard. Mrs. Stone was the kind of woman who pretended she had a heart of stone, but kept a clean Bible under the counter. "You walk out with my page, you walk out with my trouble," she warned. Hank replied softly, "If you want this town to keep calling you honest, Margaret, it has to hear your voice, not just my mouth." She stared at him for a long moment, then turned and pulled a heavy ledger from the shelf, setting it down with a heavy thump. She flipped the pages, her lips moving as she read, until her expression changed, just a shade. "There," she said, pointing. It was a clean entry, rope, 1 coil paid cash, but it was signed with a fake name. "That handwriting isn't mine," she said, her brow furrowing. "Someone wrote that after the fact." Hank leaned in. "Who else has your book?" She hesitated. "Clerk Vance has been in here. Said he was checking receipts for county business." Hank felt a surge of anger. The corruption went deeper than he thought. Mrs. Stone lowered her voice. "Hank, you take that page, and you make an enemy. You already have enough." Hank tapped the line with his finger. "I'm not collecting enemies, Margaret. I'm counting them." She glanced through the window at Sarah, then reached under the counter and pulled out a bundle of delivery slips tied with string. "This came with the last shipment," she said, handing him a slip. "Rope is marked by the supplier's seal. Folks don't notice that. I do. It doesn't prove a crime by itself, but it proves where it came from. She pressed the slip into his hand, and that matters when someone is lying. Hank folded the receipt and tucked it deep inside his shirt, right against his skin where he could feel the crinkle of the paper. As he stepped back out onto the wooden boardwalk, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A man was leaning against a post across the street. Not a deputy, not a friend, just a pair of paid eyes tracking his movements. Hank ignored him, climbed onto the wagon seat, and clicked the reins. They had barely made it 2 streets past the town limits when a rider came tearing around the corner, dust flying up in a choking cloud. It was Jed Cooper, a neighbor from the property bordering Hank's. His face was pale beneath the brim of his hat, and his horse was lathered in sweat. "Hank," Jed called out, breathless and shaken. "Your hay's shed. It's got a scorch patch." Like someone lit it just long enough to prove they could, then stomped it out and rode off. Sarah sat up on the blankets, as if she had been physically struck. The color drained from her face. Hank went perfectly still for a heartbeat, his hands gripping the leather reins tight. "How bad?" he asked, his voice low. "Bad enough to make a point," Jed replied, wiping grit from his forehead. "Not enough to burn it down. But the message is clear." Hank looked back at Sarah. She whispered, her voice trembling, "He's telling you he can reach you." Hank nodded once. "Yes." He turned the team toward home, the wagon wheels groaning as they picked up speed. His mind was working in a straight, cold line now. Thomas Davis was pushing from both sides, legal threats in town and physical threats at the ranch. He was trying to force Hank to choose between saving his property and saving a woman who had no one else. Hank kept his eyes locked on the road, but his hand unconsciously drifted to the folded slip inside his shirt. A ledger line and a supplier seal weren't weapons. Not until the whole town was forced to look at them. He glanced back at Sarah, who was huddled under the blanket. "Tomorrow at the courthouse," Hank said over the rattle of the wheels, "they're going to wave paper in my face." Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes filled with fear. "And you're going to wave what?" she asked. Hank looked ahead, watching the dust rise in a steady ribbon behind them. He spoke quietly, making a promise he wasn't proud of needing to make. "I'm going to make the whole town look at the rope." But the road home wasn't empty. Far ahead, Hank saw 2 riders posted up near a fence line, sitting their horses with a lazy, arrogant patience. They weren't blocking the road. Not exactly. They sat off to the side, just close enough to intrude, their hats pulled low and their hands resting loose near their waists. It was the posture of men who had all the time in the world. Hank slowed the team, not stopping, but not speeding up either. He let the wagon roll forward with the deliberate pace of a man who refuses to be hurried by strangers. Sarah saw them and went still on the blankets, making herself small. Jed rode up behind the wagon, breathing hard, keeping his distance as if he didn't want to be caught in the crossfire of whatever this was. One of the riders lifted a gloved hand in a lazy wave, a gesture that mocked neighborliness. Hank didn't wave back. When the wagon drew even with them, the rider called out, "Miller." Hank kept his eyes forward. "Morning." The other rider chuckled, a dry, scratching sound. "You headed home to save your hay? That's decent of you." Hank finally turned his head to look at them. "What do you want?" he asked flatly. The first rider leaned forward in his saddle, leather creaking. "Davis asked us to pass a message," he said, his voice casual. "You're holding his wife. Folks in town are saying things. He doesn't like folks saying things." Hank looked at the man like he was counting the teeth in a horse's mouth. "And you came all this way just to tell me that?" The rider shrugged. "We came to help you make a choice." Sarah let out a small, terrified sound. "Hank," she whispered. He lifted a hand toward her without looking back, a quiet signal to stay down. The rider nodded toward the wagon bed. "She can come with us right now," he said. "You can keep your ranch, keep your peace, and keep your nose out of Davis' business." Hank let a beat pass, long enough for the horses to snort and stamp in the heat. Then he said, simply, "No." The second rider smiled, a look of mock pity. "That's a shame," he said. "Choices get expensive." Hank kept his voice even, refusing to rise to the bait. "You two are standing in the road on a fine morning," he said. "That tells me you're not here to kill me. You're here to scare me." The first rider tipped his hat. "Same difference to some men." Hank nodded once. "I'm not some men." He didn't draw his gun. He didn't raise his voice. He just clicked the reins and kept rolling, the wagon passing them as if they were nothing more than rotting fence posts. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, a sharp crack echoed as a rock hit the side of the wagon. Sarah flinched violently. Hank didn't turn around. Another rock came sailing through the air, landing in the dust right in front of the horse's hooves. It wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to make the team jump to cause chaos. Hank pulled the reins firm, steadying the horses with a calm authority before panic could take root. Behind him, one of the riders called out, his voice turning hard. "Tomorrow at the courthouse. If you show up with her, you better bring more than a sad story, old man." Hank kept going until the fence line was just a smear in the distance. Only then did he let himself breathe out. Jed rode up alongside, his face tight with anxiety. "You want me to follow you home?" he asked. Hank shook his head. "I want you to ride back to town," he said. Jed blinked. "Go find Sheriff Miller," Hank instructed. "Tell him I sent a telegraph. Tell him it's not just a family matter anymore. Tell him there is rope and there is Scorch." Jed swallowed, then nodded and turned his horse without another question. When they reached the ranch, the sun was high and mean. The hay shed wasn't burning, but the black mark was there, charred boards, and the acrid smell of someone proving a point. Hank kicked the loose hay apart, stomping the last warm spot flat. He found the specific char mark where the flame had been placed carefully, like a man lighting a cigar. It wasn't an accident. It was a signature. Hank walked over to the porch where Sarah was standing, her hands clenched white around his coat. He held out the folded delivery slip and the note from Mrs. Stone. "This is what we take to town," he said. Sarah didn't touch the papers. She looked at them with distrust. "Paper didn't help me yesterday," she said softly. "It will help you tomorrow," Hank promised, "but only if we make people look at it." That night, the house felt small and fragile, like a glass bottle in a storm. Hank didn't light many lamps, keeping the rooms in a soft, orange glow that didn't spill too far into the yard. He sat by the window with a cup of cold coffee, watching the shadows of the trees stretch and pull across the dirt. Sarah was in the back room, and for the first time, Hank heard the soft, rhythmic creak of the rocking chair. It was a human sound, a sound of life continuing, and it made the charred wood of the hay shed feel less like a defeat and more like a motivation. He realized then that Thomas Davis wasn't just fighting for a wife or a reputation. He was fighting to keep his world small and controlled, where his word was the only law that mattered. The morning of the hearing arrived with a sky that looked like bruised tin. Hank helped Sarah into her best dress, which she had scrubbed clean the night before. She looked different now, not stronger, exactly, but more present, as if she had finally decided to inhabit her own skin again. As they drove into Cheyenne, the town felt changed. The usual morning bustle was there, but the air was thick with a waiting silence. People didn't just watch them pass. They stopped what they were doing and turned, their faces unreadable. Hank saw Deputy Reed standing by the courthouse steps, looking uncomfortable in a stiff collar, and next to him, Thomas Davis was holding court with a group of local businessmen, laughing at something one of them had said. When Hank pulled the wagon to a stop, the laughter died away. Thomas didn't move, but his eyes locked on his Sarah with a cold, possessive intensity that made her hand tremble where it rested on the seat. "Steady," Hank whispered, not looking at her. "Just keep your eyes on the door." They walked up the steps, and for a moment the crowd blocked the way. It wasn't a violent wall, just a group of men who refused to step aside. Hank didn't push. He simply stood there, a tall, weathered man with a quiet authority, until the space opened up. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the nervous sweat of 100 people packed into a room built for 50. Justice Hartwell sat at the high bench, his spectacles catching the light. He looked down at the room with a practiced indifference, though Hank noticed how often the judge's eyes flickered toward Thomas Davis. "This is an informal inquiry," Hartwell began, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, "to determine the welfare of a citizen and the validity of a husband's claim." Thomas stood up first, his voice clear and resonant. He spoke of a confused wife, a helpful neighbor who had overstepped, and the sanctity of the home. He didn't sound like a monster. He sounded like a victim of a misunderstanding. To a room full of people who valued order above all else, it was a very convincing performance. When it was Hank's turn, he didn't go to the front. He stayed by Sarah's side. "I don't have a speech," Hank said, his voice carrying clearly to the back of the room. "But I have a rope." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hank reached into a burlap sack he had brought and pulled out the length of brand-new, store-bought line he had cut from the tree. He laid it on the table in front of the judge. "This isn't ranch rope," Hank said. "It didn't come from a barn. It came from a general store, 3 days before Sarah was found tied to a tree." Thomas let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "That proves nothing. Anyone can buy rope." "True," Hank agreed, his voice dropping to a dangerous level of calm. "But not everyone pays cash and signs a fake name in Margaret Stone's ledger." He pulled out the delivery slip and the note Mrs. Stone had given him. "And not everyone has a notch in their boot heel that matches the prints circled around that tree like a vulture." The room went dead silent. Hank looked at the judge. "You can look at the paper Thomas brought, or you can look at the marks on this woman's wrists. One of them is a lie written in ink. The other is the truth written in skin." The silence stretched out, becoming heavy and uncomfortable. Justice Hartwell looked at the rope, then at the delivery slip, and finally at Thomas, whose face was beginning to lose its composed mask. Sarah stood up then, her voice small but clear in the quiet room. "He didn't want the baby," she said, looking not at the judge, but at the townspeople who had judged her. "He said the baby would make him look small. So he tried to make me disappear while everyone was looking." It wasn't a scream. It was a simple statement of fact, and it cut through the room like a cold wind. The paper that Thomas had relied on suddenly looked very thin and very fragile against the weight of a human voice. Justice Hartwell sat in a silence that felt heavier than any gavel strike. He looked at Thomas Davis, whose face had turned a deep, ugly shade of red, and then at the rope sitting like a dead snake on the evidence table. The townspeople were no longer whispering. They were leaning in, their faces shifting from suspicion to a cold, hard clarity. The paper Thomas had used to control the narrative was effectively shredded by the simple, physical presence of the truth. Hartwell finally cleared his throat, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "The court finds that the safety of the individual outweighs the current claim of the household," he announced, his words carefully chosen to save his own reputation. "Sarah is to remain under the protection of the county until a full investigation into these inconsistencies is completed." It wasn't a total victory, but it was the first time Sarah had breathed a full breath in years. As they walked out of the courthouse, Thomas Davis was blocked by a group of men who had once called him a friend. They didn't say a word. They just stood in his way, forcing him to see that the world he had built on lies was beginning to crumble. Hank led Sarah back to the wagon, his hand steady on her elbow. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes after a fever finally breaks. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows over the hills, and for the first time, the charred wood of the hay shed didn't look like a threat. It just looked like wood that could be replaced. As they reached the porch, Sarah stopped and looked out over the land. "What now?" she asked, her voice hushed. Hank leaned against the railing, looking at the horizon. "Now, you stay as long as you need," he said. "The baby gets a roof, and you get a name that doesn't come with a side of fear. A child shouldn't be born owing anyone an apology for existing." He looked at her, his eyes kind and tired. "Real justice isn't usually loud, Sarah. It's just the slow work of good people refusing to look away when things get ugly. This story reminds us that it's always easier to believe a rumor or a piece of paper than it is to look into someone's eyes and see their pain. We often stay quiet because it's comfortable or because we don't want to mix in family matters, but silence is exactly what allows cruelty to grow. The moral of this journey is simple. Truth doesn't need a loud voice to be powerful. It just needs one person brave enough to stand up and point at the rope. When we choose to do the next right thing, even when it's small and even when it's dangerous, we stop a lie from becoming a law. The silence following the judge's decision didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a long overdue exhale. Hank led Sarah out of the courthouse, and as they stepped onto the porch, the town seemed to hold its breath. Thomas Davis was standing by the hitching rail, his face twisted into a mask of pure, silent rage. He looked at his wife, the woman he had tried to break with rope and ruin with lies, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see fear. He saw a woman standing tall, supported by the steady presence of a man who didn't care about his status or his threats. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but a local shopkeeper who had been watching the whole scene stepped in front of him, turning his back on Thomas to offer Sarah a respectful nod. The social wall Thomas had built around himself had finally crumbled. They drove back to the ranch as the evening sky turned a deep, bruised purple. The air was cooler now, smelling of rain and sagebrush. When they pulled into the yard, the charred mark on the hay shed was still there, a black scar against the wood, but it no longer felt like a symbol of defeat. To Hank, it was just a reminder that the truth always leaves a mark on those who try to burn it. He helped Sarah down from the wagon, her movements more fluid and confident than they had been just 48 hours ago. She walked toward the house, stopping for a moment to look at the horizon where the sun was disappearing. "You don't have to worry about the road anymore," Hank said, leaning against the wagon wheel. "The town knows. And once a town knows the truth, a lie has nowhere left to sleep." Sarah looked back at him, a small, genuine smile touching her lips, the first one Hank had seen. "I thought the paper was everything," she whispered. "I thought if he had the law on his side, I was already dead." Hank shook his head slowly. "Paper is just wood and ink, Sarah. It can be burned and it can be torn. But a person's dignity, you have to give that away for it to be gone. And you never did." That night, there were no shadows moving in the yard. No rocks hit the roof, and no riders lingered by the fence. The peace that settled over the ranch was heavy and real. Hank sat on his porch, cleaning his gear by the light of a single lantern, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with money or land. He had protected something far more valuable. He knew that Thomas Davis would eventually face the full weight of the investigation. But more importantly, he knew that Sarah and her child would never have to hide from their own names again. This story is a powerful reminder that we live in a world where official stories and loud accusations often drown out the quiet truth. We are frequently told to mind our own business, to look away when things get uncomfortable, or to trust the paper over our own instincts. But the moral of this journey is that true human character is revealed not in how we follow the rules, but in how we protect the vulnerable when the rules are being used as a weapon. Real justice isn't found in a courtroom gavel or a legal document. It is found in the heart of a person who refuses to let a neighbor suffer in silence. We must remember that every time we stay silent in the face of a lie, we give that lie the power to become the truth. But when we stand up, even if our hands are shaking and the cost is high, we break the cycle of cruelty. Justice is a choice we make every single day. It's the choice to see the person behind the rumor, to value a life over a reputation, and to realize that a simple act of kindness can be the strongest shield in the world. Sarah's story didn't end with a tragedy because one man decided that "not my problem" wasn't an answer he could live with. In the end, the only thing more permanent than a lie is the peace that comes from doing the right thing.